Hey there, it's Ryan. Welcome to today's fall painting lesson. We are going to be working on this Misty scene right here, and before we begin, I will run you through our materials. I will be personally working with pigments from Winsor & Newton. That includes a cadmium yellow, deep hue, cadmium red, an ultramarine blue, burnt umber, Mars black, titanium white, a Naples yellow, and realistically, your green of choice. With that, I will also be working with my brush set. It is a 5-piece brush set, and I use it for all the lessons here on the channel, and right now, it's also 50% off to celebrate the start of fall. So if you're interested in picking up the exact same brushes that I'm working with here today, you can do so in the video description, and you can also find the code to get that 50% off right there as well. With that, I will be working on an 8x10 inch canvas. I have a small dish of water and some paper towel to wipe off all of my excess water and pigment. Now, if you're looking at the image and you're thinking, oh no, I'm not great at drawing, don't worry, I also have the traceable up over on Patreon, so you will get the perspective, the sizing, the details, all of that just right. And up there you can also get things like the reference photos, bonus lessons, we do art critiques, and you can also get my ebooks, which include acrylics for beginners. So if you're interested, check it out, but those are the materials and we are about to get started. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, which I will dip in a little bit of water, then proceed to wipe off the excess. This will just keep our paint wet for a little bit longer. From there, we'll grab a good amount of our titanium white, hint of Mars black, and about double that in our ultramarine blue. It's not too bright, it's not too dark. Great pigment to start lining the sky. And I'll work around some of the foliage to be, but not all of it. More of the larger distinct areas. We can draw everything else back in a little bit later. Now we're going to continue working this pigment down till we're about a third of the way into our sky. And then we'll interject some additional titanium white into the mix. This will not only brighten it, but it'll also desaturate it, which is great because we do want to start moving this into a bit more of a yellow. I'll also do a bit of a blend upwards, yet again, doubling down on titanium white. We'll work this to a point around the drawn-in clouds that I have, but again, I'm not too concerned about covering them up because we can always go back and re-sketch them, and then I'll just blend this back up into the rest of the sky. I'm not applying much pressure because I don't want to add streaks. And now as we get closer to the bottom, one last time, we'll exclusively work with our ultramarine blue as our pigment. Do a little bit of a blend as we do. Working it softly, and then for the first time we'll interject quite a bit of our Naples yellow. It's important that it's Naples yellow because regular yellow will typically turn to more of a green when mixed with a blue, and this one, because it's so not saturated, will do a great job of keeping its golden look to it. Now to make it perfect, we'll also grab a hint of our cadmium red hue because this will make the yellow that we're working with a little bit warmer, a little bit more orange, and that perfect base warmth for the sun to kind of work its way in its light outwards. Now I've gone ahead and re-sketched in all of our clouds. We're going to start painting them with our titanium white, a little bit of our Naples yellow, and the smallest hint of Mars black. We just want the Mars black in there because we don't want to go in with the brightest pigment just yet. We want room to brighten it, especially around the sun and the light. So I'm going to switch to a liner brush, great for working in detail, and detail we are certainly working with here. Going to begin on the edge of my cloud, and before I really fill it in, I want to get the majority of my edges nicely applied, just because when we have fresh paint, we have the best opportunity to render our sharpest markings. I'm going to do little pieces that stick out of the cloud, lots of unique bumps to make it a bit more interesting, and sometimes I'll also work with my brush in a circular motion. That'll just blend our pigments into the sky, make it a bit softer. You don't have to, but if you do want a softer looking cloud, it's a really easy way of going about it. Now, it's important to recognize that we're not just painting a singular cloud, we're painting a couple of them, and they're going to connect through little pieces, little bridges almost. And some of them can be dotted. They don't all have to be done with hard lines, and I actually think these clouds get a lot more interesting when you do open up spaces, when everything isn't hyper connected. Then you have room for something that looks a bit more unique, but also a bit more real. We don't want our clouds to look hard, we want them to look soft and floating, moving within that sky. So you can see that I'm taking little breaks in between some of my applications, and I think that's a big part of it. Now I'll take a bit of a step back here because we also have clouds to the right hand side, which is nice. It'll balance our canvas well, and it also brings these warmer yellows over into a more blue area where they can actually stand out and have a bit more prominence. The closer we get to the left and towards the bottom, the more we lose them in the light, right? And that's a good thing. Having that transition will make it a lot more interesting. However, it's a beautiful color, and we do want opportunities to kind of show it off. Here, show you how it gets lost through a series of taps that just kind of work their way into the distance. You can have some that separate. We don't want too many. This isn't a complicated or large cloud, but now we have that transition. We can start filling in portions of these clouds with our highlight. However, these are pretty big areas, and it'll likely be best if we do so with a different brush. So let's switch. Here we have a filbert brush. It's great because the corners are rounded, which is wonderful for soft blends, but it does have that sharper top, so we can also get some good details with it. Also, it carries quite a bit of paint. Now our filbert brush is nice and damp, so we can start working in the filler, being careful around my edges, but occasionally overlapping them, either with the sharper portion of the brush if I really want to solidify a shape, or the softer portion if I want to have it kind of drift off into the sky. Now we are going to make our clouds much more dimensional than this, but we do need a base layer, and this is a great easy way of going about it. I'm also going to go over areas a couple of times as they start to dry and just build up the thickness, particularly in the centers of these. We want the edges to be a bit more transparent, a bit softer, because we do want it to feel like it's moving out into the sky, but there are going to be those center areas which are a lot more dense. Can't really see light through them because there's just too much cloud. It's easy to achieve with some extra taps. Now, while this is all still wet, we're going to interject some cadmium red into a portion of our mix, as well as some extra Mars black, titanium white, and we want a really grayed down, almost orange. The yellow and the red will produce somewhat of an orange for us, but the goal here is to really add a lot of titanium white and Mars black. We don't want it to be dark, we don't want it to be light, we want it to be very much in the middle, just a slightly darker value than what the rest of the clouds were, and this might actually be perfect. So we'll switch over. And this is wonderful. I'm going to apply this predominantly to the middle portions of the cloud, and then I'll have it softly blend out into the edges, which will get brighter, right? Because the light can move through the edges to a greater degree. More light can pass through them. They're not as thick. So right now we're just cautiously bouncing throughout the centers of our clouds, lightly using the corner of the brush to soften edges, because I don't want hard edges with this for the most part. And this will also exist more so towards the tops of the centers than it will the bottom, because the bottom will receive more light from the sun, where the tops will just be a little bit farther away. There'll be a little bit more cloud in between there. So when I'm doubling down, I'm going back over areas, I'm predominantly doing so towards the tops. That creates a little bit of a gradient, which is nice as we move towards the bottom. We can also switch to our liner brush for the more unique areas. Get the details in there as well. And this is something you can go back and forth with for quite some time, just figuring out where you want that light, where you want that shadow. However, we do need to go a little bit darker. I'll grab extra Mars black. This brush typically isn't great for blending, but we don't need much paint, so it will do quite well here. And with this, we are just going to go towards the tops of some of these clouds. Everything is still wet, so we're painting wet into wet, which is nice. Grab some extra water for our brush. That'll help us keep things wet longer and just thin them out. Make it easier to make sharp markings. Make it easier to blend pigments. Condense our bristles. A lot of good is being done through that. I'm really just applying these towards the top portions. Because it is quite stark. And you can see there's a lot of bouncing around. I'm trying to keep the camera a little bit farther back just so you can see how it's all balancing. Now we'll just go back in with the filbert, as it'll offer us those softer blends that I do think we want in here. And that'll just make things feel a whole lot more natural and cohesive. What we also really need to do is start reincorporating some of our lighter hues, like the golden yellows. So now back to the liner brush and our Naples yellow. I'm applying it in large part towards the bottom, and I'm doing a slight blend up. This is just going to soften a lot of those darker hues, give us some very natural transitions. I'm also going to do some little taps to incorporate some details within our clouds. I might also go towards the tops and just add a little bit, not to bring light downwards, because again, we want the majority of the light at the bottom of our clouds, but just to soften it and create a slight additional transition. A lot of my lines with those darker pigments are sharper towards the top, just because they were difficult to do those blends, but now we can reincorporate those blends and just make it all nice and unified. Also going to interject some extra titanium white and brighten up the mixture that is closer to the left, because this side is closer to the sun and we want it to really pop. Now we're not quite done with the sky. We do have some additional clouds towards the top here, and as you can see, I am going in with the filbert brush. You can still start it with the liner if you feel much more comfortable. I personally just feel like I've warmed up fairly well with the liner, and I'm ready to work with a slightly larger brush. It's a little bit more difficult, but we can still use that sharp front of it to block in, and I'm essentially just saving myself a step. And we'll do lots of little taps and unique markings throughout that area. But once I have that applied, as you know, we need our inner cloud mixture. So we'll just remix this. It's red, Naples yellow, Mars black, and titanium white. We apply it towards the top and the center of our clouds at hand, just like so. We go for a darker variant of that mixture, so extra Mars black. I am going to switch to a liner brush, build that towards the tops in selective areas that are going to be more dense. Blend everything out through a bit of a circular motion. It's all still wet, so blends are very easy, especially considering how damp the brush currently is. And from there, we're just going to build out some of those tails to our clouds, the unique pieces which separate them from each other, and just make the painting as a whole a lot more interesting. Alright? You don't want to do the same thing too many times, so I am being careful of that. But you can see how much more quickly we can paint the clouds once we have a little practice, once we're warmed up. I think this one probably took a sixth of the time that one of these ones did. And that just shows you that practice pays off, gets you comfortable. I'm not sure how many clouds I really want to do up here. Don't want it to be too distracting in general, but we can do a bit of it. And then some of them aren't even going to have the darker mixture because they're just not going to be that dense. There isn't going to be that much light moving through it. And it'll just be a bit more airy, a bit more wispy. Like these. They're not unfinished clouds. They're just a little bit softer. Now we are going to take a step back, and from a distance with our liner brush, we're going to develop a couple softer clouds through here. Get the majority of the pigment off of our brush, either on a painting cloth, a paper towel, or just other areas that require highlight. And then I'm going to do little taps, occasionally little drags, that essentially take this side, this top area of our clouds, and brings it back down into the bottom area. So this is very meticulous work. It's very intentional, creating leading lines, but I'm trying to do it from a bit of a distance so that I can see the canvas as a whole and just make sure that we're serving the right purpose of bringing it all together. And I don't want to do too many. This is more of a background effect. It is behind all of these larger clouds, but it's very unifying. Now we'll work on the background here, and we'll do so with quite a bit of Mars Black. That's going to be the base of this mix. We'll add some titanium white because we don't want it to be a pure black, and we want to brighten it up enough that we can start to see hue in it. Speaking of hue, we're going to work in some of our cadmium red, give it some warmth. We're also going to work in some of our Naples yellow. And the goal here is to render a nice, warm, desaturated, almost silhouetted hue for the background, and I think this is brilliant. So, with this, we can roughly work around our edges. I'm not going all the way to the top where my drawing is. I'm just filling in the majority of the body of our subject through here, using quite a bit of pressure with my brush to get large applications. If we press softly, the bristles won't expand and we'll get something very tight and intentional. If we do press quite a bit, we get these larger markings. I'm also going to work with myriad of horizontal strokes towards the bottom. Now we are going to fix up this line later on when we do the reflection of it, but for now we just need a guiding point, essentially. Make sure this is all nice and thick, and we'll get in close for the details. Now, as you can see up close, the pigment is quite reflective, and it will remain so until it starts to dry a little bit. So I'm not too worried about that. Just know it'll look a little bit darker as it does dry. And until then, I'm going to work my edges with the liner brush, as you can see. Initially, this is just going for that silhouetted effect, which means we are simply working texture in. Along the tops of this, we are making all of these smaller markings, which just wouldn't really have been achievable using the larger flat-headed brush. Really trying to let the brush do a lot of dancing. We are leaving openings in between some of these taps. It's also okay if some of them are less opaque than others. And I try to also bring down some of those taps, just in case we grab from a slightly different mix on the palette. I want to ensure that we're keeping consistent with our textured applications. Here, I think you can see this pigment's a little bit different from this. So we're just going to tap that in. We're lucky in that it's brighter, so it looks like there's light working its way down through those taps. It's a gradient, not one of blending, but one of texture, one of pattern. And we just continue working our way along here. And again back down. Now stepping back and looking at all of these protruding areas in relation to their reflections, you notice they're a little bit different. That can happen, that will happen, that is a-okay. Now here we are, quite a bit closer. We're going to add some additional Naples yellow to our mix. Make it just a bit brighter, a little bit warmer with that pigment alone. Then grab our liner brush, expand some of the taps that are closer here to the left-hand side, and just bring those downwards into our negative space. And the idea here is that we can even craft the idea of trees. Here we might have a tree, so we can just go along the edge of the left-hand side because that's where the light is predominantly going to be coming from. And then here we have another tree, and we can just work that down. It'll dissipate as we work farther down, as there'll be more shadows towards the bottom, and we just won't have that much light. But we can add this really nice, subtle layer, texture detail, and this isn't individual leaves or anything, it's just the implication of clusters of them. And we'll just have this lessen as you work towards the right hand side. It's very easy to do. We just let the pigment run out on our brush. We do the majority of our taps over here, and then I'm going to finalize over here. But we really don't want to do too much. It's just tap here or there. We can even have little protruding areas that catch a little bit more light. But for the most part, that's it. That's all we need. You know what? Before we really proceed, let's actually take that same liner brush, titanium white, Naples yellow, and let's create a much brighter variant that we can tap towards the top, again over on the left hand side, but let's only make it on the very tops and create additional protrusions with this pigment. Something where it's very easy to add, but it's difficult to take away. So we go with the less is more approach. We don't do much in the beginning. We just see how we like it, and I think I will like it, but I don't think I want a lot of it. It's also something we can go back and add in abundance a little bit later. There isn't really a clock on doing a lot of it right now because it's not reliant on all of this still being wet, right? It's just an addition that we can work on before we do the mist. Though we do work on the mist fairly soon. So, I think I'm quite happy with this. We'll put our liner brush down. We'll pick up our larger flat. And for the first time in a long time, we will remix the blue that we had at the top of the sky, but we're going to make it a little bit darker. Typically, reflections are slightly darker than that which they are reflecting. So we're going to incorporate some extra Mars Black. The Mars Black will desaturate it, so I'm going to also work in some extra Ultramarine blue. I'll do a little test up here. I can see that's significantly darker. So let's just go with slightly more titanium white, do another test. And the beauty of testing it towards the top, left to right hand side, is that we're going to cover this with foliage. So it doesn't really matter. That said, this pigment works great. So we're going to apply this all the way across the bottom. I am going to cover up a lot of my drawing. Again, I'm not worried, we can always redraw it. If you're up over on Patreon, you can download the traceable, and that will ensure that you get it just right. Now, as we work our way upwards, we're going to interject that extra titanium white. We're working essentially backwards from the initial steps, which makes sense because we are working on a reflection. We're mirroring that top, and it's just the same top, but upside down. So yet again, more titanium white to the point where it's starting to look a little gray because there is still Mars black in our mixture. We get a soft blend down, and if you want to incorporate some strokes, you can do that. Press a little bit harder, you get some line work that can be kind of nice as it's water, but I do want a clear reflection, so I'm not going to do too much. Now as we get higher, we do need our Naples yellow, a lot of our titanium white, hint of our Mars black. We'll do a test right beside here. Again, this can/should be a little bit darker than that which we've previously worked with. And then we'll go for our blend. I'm going to work on a little bit of a diagonal angle initially, and I'm just doing that. One sec, we'll also get this area. Almost forgot. And I work in a little bit of a diagonal application. That way we bring this pigment not only left and right, but also downwards. And we'll just work that all the way across. Not too worried about slight imperfections, as we're going to have a lot of foliage down here, different kinds. But I like that a lot. We of course lost our drawing, but I'll go ahead and just resketch in those clouds. Won't be too tricky. Now, I've gone ahead and just redrawn in our clouds, so we'll remix up the pigments that we used. I still have a bit of each of them here on my palette. I kept that purposefully dried just so that I could remix these a little bit later and have a good reference point for what we really want. So we'll just start off here by actually mixing up a fairly good amount. Mars black, hint of titanium white, a lot of Naples yellow. We will go in with the liner brush. Grab that. And I'm actually going to begin where I did at the top, which is on this side, just because it's such a visually notable space. It gives us a good, easy base to work off of. It's not too tricky to figure out. And here we have a couple of options, as this is a reflection. We could make it exactly the way it is up at the top, or we could add in some extra horizontal lines in the process, and that would give us something that's implying the water has some movement to it. I think I'm going to start by making it a bit more of a clear-cut reflection, and then should we want to make it a bit more unique, we can play around with the idea of movement. But here I'm just getting the edges, the very watery mix, because I want to cover a lot of ground. We'll switch over to our filbert brush as we did initially. and we'll start working that in. You can see this also has quite a bit of water in it, so it's very thin for the initial layer. That's not a problem. You can always build it up. Now we'll get a little bit closer for you, and we'll just start thickening up, for the most part, the middle portions of this. Much like the top, we are going to incorporate darker values and hues, with more reds in them. But I do want to start with this, and I am, as you can see, still trying to make the edges soft. So there's a bit of a blend with the corner of the brush, and if there's going to be a distinctive difference between our reflection and the actual clouds, that will certainly be one of them. Now we'll just tap in those. We're working in larger areas, so it's a bit easier to maneuver even with this more sizable brush than the liner. But again, I can use that top part to make it nice and sharp where we need to. I like that a lot. And as much as I like painting close up like that, it is important that we take those steps back and we make sure that we get a good wide perspective, because that is what's going to keep this piece as a whole visually consistent, right? There we go. Now we'll head back to the centers. We'll start mixing up our darker variant of these hues. So quite a bit of Cad Red, Naples Yellow, Mars Black. You can see I'm doing a lot of the mixing with the filbert brush, not a bad brush to mix with. More titanium white. This can be a little bit darker than the previous mixes. I'm just trying to take the saturation out to a point. There we go. Now we'll take the majority of that pigment off of our brush because we want to pick up a controllable amount. And then on the top, we applied this for the most part towards the tops of the clouds, but in this scenario we're applying it for the most part towards the bottoms. And we want to blend this with the yellows to the best of our ability. That's going to soften a lot of the values, make them less harsh. So I'm not going to do too much in any one spot to begin with, because I am going to want to go back into a lot of these areas while they're still wet. I think that's enough. With our liner brush, so we're in a more detailed space. So we'll add that, and then we'll soften, work around, and then we'll do a little blend inwards, work around, do a little blend inwards. And then if we need to redarken it, we can, that's not an issue. I think this area in particular needs quite a bit of softening. I really like going back and forth with these. I think it very quickly renders a nice looking space. We'll also make a more titanium white heavy mixture of that brighter pigment for right along here. Remember, this is closer to the sun, and it will be brighter, despite the fact that the reflection itself is darker. We'll just let that dissipate as we move towards the right-hand side of the painting. Now, stepping back, I think that's quite a nice reflection. It's very close, though I do want to make it a little bit more interesting. So we're going with titanium white, Mars black, our ultramarine blue. We're remixing the blue that we used, not at the very top, but kind of in the middle. So we don't want it to be too dark, we don't want it to be too bright, we don't want it to be too saturated. And we can easily just do a little test over to the side. Looks great. Going to incorporate some movement in the water, and that's going to overlap portions of our reflection. But it's a very subtle movement. There isn't much of it. There we go. More so towards the forefront. Just like so. Okay, I like that a lot. We have slight changes. You can even add highlights to the areas that are lifted by the water a little bit. Don't have to, but just want to show you different ideas, different options. If we don't like it, we can always just paint the more flat water hue again. But so far, I'm a fan. Next, we are going back to a pigment similar to what we have up there, which doesn't actually have any of the blue. We have our Cad red, titanium white, Mars black, Naples yellow. You want the darker variant of it. Remember that we did 3 versions. First was the base, followed by the highlights. And this can be slightly darker, but I think I want it to be extremely close. So I'll work my edge. Again, rather than doing a singular elongated stroke, I like to do many that piece together. And that's just because when you make a singular stroke, typically your hand will dive down or move upwards depending upon the way in which you move. And I just feel like I have more control through multiple strokes, like so. We'll bring this not all the way to the bottom, but close to it. Similarly to how we did the top. And now I'm covering more of our foliage. It's okay, we'll redraw it in just like we did the clouds. And then, very simply, we'll just lock in the rest of this before we head in with our details. From there, we'll get a little bit closer, and with our liner brush, we will start tapping on the actual reflections. There's nice protruding details. They don't have to be absolutely perfect, but we are going to do our best to create something that's rather reminiscent of that which is going on right above. Also, you may hear a little bit of noise in the background. It's a Nuit Blanche here in Toronto tonight, which is on the surface and intended to be a night where a lot of different artists set up multimedia, mixed media pieces throughout the city. And it's this very unique, eclectic assortment of art that you can just find by essentially exploring. That's amazing. But that's what it is on the surface. And what a lot of it also is an excuse for people to go out and drink on the streets throughout the evening. It's from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. So tonight, I thought about going and looking at the art, but realistically, you can kind of do that the day before, the day after. And that's always fun. And that really is about the art. And so tonight, I thought I would stay in and do some painting. Finish this up so that you had a lesson. And to be honest, very happy with that decision. I feel like the older I get, the happier I am to spend a night inside and read a book, watch a film, do some painting, do a little writing. And I know that sounds wildly boring. I know I'm boring now, but I really do appreciate the simple things at this point. Actually, tomorrow I have a plan, and I am going to try a new pumpkin bread recipe that I'm very excited about. So again, we are just very, very lively. That said, I think this is going well. I'm a little too close to see the imperfections. Admittedly, there might be areas that are off, whether it be slightly or dramatically, but I will learn that when I take a couple steps back in the somewhat near future. Though I figured we would just conclude this area, and then we'll take those steps back. There we go. From here, we'll start mixing a new pigment for our mist, and that is going to be, for the most part, our Naples yellow, a little bit of our cad red. We're also going to throw in, for the first time, a hint of cadmium yellow deep hue. This is just going to give it slightly more of an orange, a bit more saturation, and we'll work in some Mars black just so it isn't too bright. Then we switch to our filbert brush, make sure that's nice and damp. Grab our new orange pigment, and this is initially going to run along the tops of the water, predominantly towards the back, and it'll stretch all the way to the other side, but it will get progressively less bright as you move that way. And before it dries, we're going to softly work it up and down. We want this mist to look like it's working its way up into the air. So I'm taking those hard lines and I'm just softening them. Now we're going to grab more of that pigment. We'll go back in yet again on the left-hand side. And now I'm going to move downwards, leaving openings. And I'm softly blending a lot of these applications using the rounded corner of this brush. This is something we'll need to build up over numerous layers. Again, letting it progressively get softer as we move towards the right-hand side. And we do want this to raise quite a bit more. We started low just because we do like that less is more approach. but eventually it is time to build. Now we'll take a step back, and we need to make this a lot more dense and a lot brighter, predominantly on the line in which we initially created, but also as we move downwards. And again, a lot of these markings are made to be quite soft, using the corners of the filbert brush. Well, just keep grabbing additional pigment. We're working over a dark pigment, so we need a lot of layers to really build it up, as that dark pigment will show through the initial applications. And we'll work this significantly more along the edge. Again, we can start with a horizontal line, but before it dries, we do need to switch to something that's all vertical. Let it dissipate. It's a lot of back and forth. We need to make this a lot softer, create a greater transition as you work down. Just because this area is less bright doesn't mean that it's completely void of the mist that goes out onto the water. And I think we need a much brighter variant than this, something with quite a bit more titanium white. So we'll mix that into our larger body of paint here. And then we'll resume building that highlight. This is probably something we brighten a couple of times, particularly towards the left-hand side. And downwards. See how we're moving more and more onto the water? We'll do little taps of the greater highlight over here, but we're not fully committing to it in the same way we did on the left. Let's yet again double up on our titanium white, maybe a little bit of Naples yellow. We're essentially just moving farther and away from the cad red and cad yellow. Still applying it with the filbert brush. And we'll apply that initially along our line. There's a little bit of blending happening because the canvas is still damp from the previous layers. I'll work this up slightly, but for the most part, this is to be dragged down. I'll do multiple layers. Now we can also work it backwards a little bit by going into a gray, the hint of our Naples yellow, and we can re-darken areas, doing a lot of it through vertical strokes. You can also work in a bit of a rounded motion if you want to give the mist a little bit of a wispy effect. And you can see I'm working that up even into the light. I might soften the top area, just push it back a little bit so that this line of highlight is really the forefront visually. And we can reincorporate elements of light that we lost. Now, once we have our mist to a place we like, we're going to go for the first time into an olive green. You can also use a sap green, a green gold would also look nice, but I like how dark and earthy this one is. With that, I'm going to grab an abundance of it. I'm going to add it to a spot on my palette here that doesn't have any wet paint. This is all dry. And I'm going to mix up a mid-green using Naples yellow, Mars black, and titanium white. Want it to be a darker mid-green, but we need a lot of it. I think this will be great. So, start applying that over here in our negative space. And I'm not going quite as far as the leaves protrude. I'm sticking inwards. We'll handle the edges with a much more easily controlled brush. And this is actually covered for the most part down into here. Just like so. We also have a bit at the bottom. Now we'll fill this in to the best of our ability. And we'll get a bit closer with a different brush. Now I'm going to switch to the smaller flat-headed brush because I still want that nice sharp corner and ability to handle a good amount of paint, but I want to paint individual leaves, and this brush is fantastic for that. As you can see, we can do little cuts, which looks like the side of leaves, or we can apply more pressure and then go down and then go into the sharper portion of it. It's very easy to create a lot of shapes. We'll leave some openings. I'll just tidy up the edges so that we don't see all of the tooth in the canvas. But we're essentially just trying to create the look of falling leaves, dangling leaves. Throughout this section. I think it'll be quite prominent when we work through this area, because we have that highlight right behind, and that contrast will greatly dramatize the darker values that we're working with here. I like that a lot. Trying to use an abundance of paint so we don't have to do too many layers for these. And we are using some water because I do want to be able to use sharp applications. But that does thin it, so it's a balance we're working towards, right? Really need to elaborate on this section. And we'll just thicken up a couple of these layers. This is in the darkest green. This is again more of a mid-green. We will go in with a darker pigment. We will go in with brighter pigments, but it was important that we started with something more so in the middle on the darker side. Now, once we have our edges sorted out there, we're going to make another mixture, this time using some of our Cad Red, still using a bit of our green. This is essentially going to desaturate it to a point. When you use complementary colors, they end up taking the chroma out of each other. We'll make it relatively in the same value as our last mix. I do still want the titanium white and Mars black to thicken it up, but as you can see, going back and forth with the red and green until I have something warm. And then we'll take our liner brush, which will be nice and damp, and we'll paint some leaves which are changing color as we turn into the fall season. So we don't want all of our leaves in this painting to be a red or an orange or a green. We want it to be transitionary. We want multiple hues. We'll work some of these reds in, around, behind, in front of the greens that we have. But as you can see, they'll be presenting themselves for the most part towards the top here. And I'll get you quite a bit closer. Now, I want to leave a fair amount of space between clusters. Want to start opening this up so that it isn't so blocky in every portion. I want something that's a bit more transitionary. And you'll notice that we're leading this down into the clouds. We almost have a leading line of foliage into our clouds, which bring us down into the heart of the painting. A lot of these are little taps and drags, so I'll make a larger portion, which is for the most part circular, and then I'll drag my brush to create a sharper point or two, depending upon how many leaves I want. But these are coming off of likely the same tree. It's just changing. Do a couple more out here. We'll do a couple more out here. You can see they're getting more sparse the farther out we get. Trying to keep them nice and sharp. These are very detailed. And it's important that we don't have a rough looking aesthetic. Overlapping the clouds is a nice look because it's such a stark contrast. There we go. I'm going to take a couple steps back, just make sure it's progressing the way we want it to. Again, working some of my reds back into my greens. And we'll have a lot more of our reds on this side, so I think that's good for that area. Let's also grab some Mars black, hint of titanium white, red, equal amount of green, that way they essentially desaturate each other. It's more of a brown. between the two. So we just have this nice earthy, very dark mix. Cleaning the brush, and we'll use this, a little bit less water. We don't want too much, but we use this to render our branches, which will connect all of these clusters, foliage together. Trying to keep them extraordinarily sharp. As little pressure as possible. Some of them don't even have to lead to leaves. Like that. There will be branches that don't have a connection point, and that's okay. Now towards the bottom, using that same brush, we are going to create additional red leaves, which again will work in, but we'll also build some larger bodies. These are a bit closer to us, so I might make them slightly larger. That means dragging the brush to a greater extent. Still trying to keep a sharp edge on the applications in one place or another. And we can, of course, work some of these out just so that they feel like they fit within the rest of the painting. Can't just exist on the top and bottom, right? So we'll fill in a couple of these spots. Not too many, but just enough. We'll grab our darker pigment. Trying to make these not too soft looking. And when we make an extended motion like that, we get a very soft application, where if we break it up into multiple strokes, it looks a bit more natural most of the time. So I'm trying to make multiple applications here to keep that disjointed to a point. There we go. Trying to crisscross a couple of them just to keep it nice and dynamic. And then we can also add some buds to the tops, which will be an actually rounded application. So now I'm just trying to make sure there isn't a sharp point where the leaves there was. There we go. It's unique. Good for the setting. Now, while this all looks quite dark, could have been darker, and we are going to mix a darker variant of it using a lot of our Mars Black, olive green, hint of titanium white, and this will essentially be one of the darkest pigments that we use on the painting. This is going to be the pigment we use for the shadows in the greenery, the areas that are more inset that light can't get to, And we'll be doing so with our fan brush. Now if you've watched the lessons before, you are probably aware of the technique we're going to go in with, but we'll grab some pigment softly on both sides of our fan brush, and then we're going to go in with tapping motions. I'm rotating my brush in the air so that I get unique markings and it isn't always linear. We aren't pressing with the entirety of our brush, we're probably just using about a third at a time. And this is going to add in some texture for our leaves, but the primary purpose again is that they're going to be inset areas, areas that light cannot get to, and because of that, they will be darker. We'll add highlighted leaves over top of these, we'll add mid-valued leaves over top of these, but this is for the insets. That said, let me get you quite a bit closer so you can really see the detail, the sharpness, and the application. So, not tricky. We're going in, we're tapping, we're rotating. I'm trying to not make it too directional, but when it is directional, I try to follow the general movements of the subject, in this case the foliage. So it's falling, so my brush is starting to fall. It's working in these, for the most part, vertical taps, but occasionally we do need to rotate the brush to get those bridged areas. There we go. And then when we get into the larger negative space, it's rotation, it's randomization. We don't want too much paint on our brush, as it will eventually condense the bristles. In that case, you do need to wash your brush and then dry it very thoroughly, because you don't want to go in with a damp brush, as it will condense the bristles and make it harder to make sharp markings. I'm also going to do a second layer along the side that's farther away from the light, just because there will be darker clusters in there, and you can make some areas as a whole darker, as there will be areas that just receive less light. Now we'll take a step back and we'll add some light to our leaves. This is fully dry, so we can start reapplying. Going to begin by mixing up a slightly lighter red. Going to use a lot of my Naples yellow to do so rather than titanium white, because I don't want to turn it into a pure pink. And we'll also grab a bit of Mars black because we want it to be brighter but not too bright. We'll save those pigments for a little bit later. Switch on over to our liner brush, and we'll apply some highlight on the individual little leaves up here that will likely catch more light. So the areas behind them, the areas that wrap around them. I'll get you quite a bit closer though, because it is very detail oriented and you're quite far away. There we go. So, again, I'm looking towards the edges for the most part. Areas where light can wrap around. And I'm adding this extra light. Predominantly it's going to be on the bottom portions of these. And maybe on the left-hand side more so than the right, just because the light's still coming from around here. But some of the leaves will just let light through them as a whole, as they'll just be more thin. And in that scenario, we can highlight the entirety of a leaf, and we might do that just randomly, right? We might do that with the smaller ones because they're less developed at this point. But you can see that we're working our way around these. We can go back in with a second layer to really brighten it up. We're at least relatively so. Remember, our mix itself isn't actually bright. It's just bright in relation to the other pigments that we have around here. And I do want to do some of these down below because we are still trying to make this look like a larger cohesive piece, right? We can even do a couple brighter ones out here, avoid the dark backing. That can be a nice look. We don't want to go too far in with this, but we can go find a couple openings, or rather create them. Just like so. Love this. Now we'll go back in with the same or a very similar mix down towards the bottom. And with this, we're essentially now applying it to the tops of them for the most part. And the areas on the left. We have some overlapping leaves towards the bottom, which is neat. We'll have some green ones in here as well. So we just want to scatter these about. Similar idea to the top though. It's not the brightest pigment. It's not going to stand out too dramatically, but it'll add some nice color and transition to the painting. I'm also going to add a little bit of red to the tops of all of these circular buds. So we're just working our way across. There we go. Then we can do, like we did at the top, some transparent applications that don't have a dark backing. We just do that throughout so that it all fits together. Now we have some red highlights. It's time to also incorporate some green ones. So I'll grab my green, find a clean spot on my palette, go in with some titanium white, some Naples yellow. The Naples yellow is really the pigment that's tying all of our pigments together. And we'll also go with some Mars black because we don't want our first application to be that bright. We want it to be brighter. We don't want it to be that bright. When I find a pigment I like, and I really do like this, I'm going to double down and I'm going to mix a lot more of it. Just a hint of titanium white, and that should be great. Now, as for application, I'm actually going to switch back to the fan brush. However, you can see that it has a myriad of bristles here. What we want to do is we want to condense these. We want to make it so that it doesn't make 50 very sharp strokes. So we want 5 or 6 larger ones, similar to a size of our liner brush. And how we're going to do that, you're just going to take our dry brush, we're going to dip it in some water, wipe off the excess, and that is going to make this fork-like effect. So now instead of 50 little mark makers, we have a couple handfuls. And this would be great for rendering slightly larger leaves, but a lot of them quickly. Typically, this is how a soft fan brush is. This is a stiff bristled fan brush for the most part, but it does have tendencies like a soft bristled, and that's one of the reasons I would recommend picking up the Channel's brush set, which again is on sale right now, 50% off. You can find the link and the code in the video description. But one of the big benefits of it is that you don't need to work with a soft and a hard bristled fan brush. You essentially get both of them together. And if you watched the lessons on the channel from years ago, you know that's what I used to have to do. We'd always be bouncing back and forth between brushes until eventually, when it came time to make our brush set for the channel, this is the brush set I use for all the lessons, I decided to make one that acted like both of them. Save a lot of time. And it just made a lot more sense. Why buy multiple brushes when you can do that same technique with one, right? So here we are tapping along the edges with our green. And we go inwards just a little bit. We don't want to go too far inwards because we don't want that light that's wrapping around to go all the way around. It's only going to wrap around so much because the light is essentially almost on the opposite side of this tree. So it's important that we get the areas that surround light. So I'm looking for the openings. I'm doing some taps around those specifically and intentionally. But I am hesitant to move too far to the left. That said, we're getting into a lot of detail work here. Why don't I get you a bit closer? Now, yet again, we'll just reload the brush with some pigment. We'll find the outskirts of some of our foliage. We'll do these rotated taps, but I am being mindful of the direction in which I do tap. A lot of them are trying to move with the greenery as a whole. And sometimes I'm also letting this protrude and create new markings on the outskirts. All of these are roughly the same size as the initially implemented leaves, so it's a really great, easy way to expand. A lot of these markings are nice and sharp. Then we can bring it back in. We're going to work our way down, and this is where it intermixes with some of the reds. Very good. From there, we'll go back to the liner brush, and we can tap in individual little protrusions to add some character. Similarly to how we did the red pieces earlier. Just a bit more intent with the applications. We're doing this with that highlighted pigment. Now we're going to head to the right-hand side, and we're going to brighten our mixture by interjecting some extra Naples yellow. And not just a little bit, quite a bit. We really want this to have a warm hue to it, and the Naples yellow will get us there quickly. If you're working with a green gold, it'll also already be fairly warm, which is nice. Now going to switch back to the fan brush, make sure it's nice and damp. And I do not have a drawing of the next step on my canvas. I don't really recommend doing so. It's a lot of little pitter patters, and I think it'd be best if it's approached very organically. But what we're essentially looking to do is create the greenery that we see right through here. This looks a lot more red in the OCD screen than it actually is. It's a more green piece, and we'll warm this up, but that's all afterthoughts. Right now, we want to create some greenery some clusters that are all going to connect up here through branches. Trying to make very small markings. And as you can see, this brush is doing a great job of getting the job done quickly. We'll connect these into a couple of clusters. When we want the clusters to be dense, have a lot of foliage, we create areas without negative space in between. And then we want them to be thin or a little more sparse. Then we let those negative spaces be more abundant. We'll see the foliage over the darker hues to the bottom here, which is nice. And there'll be a lot of this. But you can see that it'll all work its way back. Again, I'm looking at this in clusters, right? I'm not doing it quickly. I'm adding a little bit, I'm thinking about it. Where do we want more? How do we want to build? Where do we add? Then once we kind of figure out that direction in general, we build and we add. We can kind of line this edge a little bit because of this larger tree. To block off a lot of the visual there. A little bit more sparse towards the top. So you can see there's almost 1, 2, 3-ish, 4, 5, 6 protrusions. There we go. Can be a little intimidating to make them more thick, more dense, but it does create a nice look when you get the right amounts. Once we have the majority of them in there, we are switching to our liner brush, as we do. And here we can apply very purposeful connective tissue. Now I'll head back to our mix with some extra Mars black and green, create a darker but not incredibly dark hue. We still want it to be a bit brighter than the darks over here. And we can either use the fan brush or the liner for this, depending upon your comfortability and intent. But I know I want to be a bit more intentional with these applications. They can be loose, they can be free, they can be done with different brushes, but I want to apply this predominantly to the middle bodies of the larger clusters and towards the backs of them. The areas that are dense to the point where they have so much foliage in front that the light over here will not be able to pass through to a great degree, and therefore it will be darker. and this is something that'll build up over multiple layers. But this is how we're going to add some depth to these free-floating pieces. We'll do even a little bit through here. The variance of values is going to do a lot to build up this space. See that? That's a lot very quickly. And I know you're quite far away, purposefully keeping you there for this part of the process, because the actual technicalities of tapping are not complicated. We're not really going with a blend or anything you haven't done before. What's really important is looking at it as a whole, looking at this area as a whole, and making sure that it all makes sense within the larger context of the painting and the lighting scheme. That we don't have clusters that are a little bit too dark and some that are too light. We're really trying to look at it as a whole, and that's also why I'm holding my brush like this. It's so I can stand farther back while I paint. So you're not the only one who's quite far away from the painting right now, and intentionally so. Now a lot of this will be lost down here, but it's important that we still incorporate it. We will still see this to a point. It is slightly brighter than the darker backdrop that I have. So despite being incredibly subtle, it will add some level of depth, and it also works nicely over the highlighted bottom that we have down here, because it is quite noticeable in those spaces for sure. Now we'll get a little closer and recreate a nice dark pigment for our stick, or our branches rather, and I'm going to make that predominantly out of the Cad Red and the green. You can see that we're just slowly stripping the saturation out of the red and turning it into more of a brown, like so. Then we'll darken it, Mars Black. I think that's actually a beautiful pigment. So, back to the liner brush, and I think ideally you do this when all of that is dry. Mine admittedly is not, but I think I'll be able to make it work. We'll start running branches from the top down. I think I have a little bit too much water and a little bit too much paint on my brush, so I just clean that off. I want nice and small markings like that. Perfect. So you can see my current technique is to apply it, or rather grab it with my brush, wipe a little bit of the excess off, and then go back in. And a lot of these are applied with next to no pressure. I'm working my way in between some of the foliage, but sometimes I'm also going on top of it. I think that there's a balance to be struck. You don't have to connect all of the leaves. Sometimes the branch will just be too small to see, but I am trying to connect them where I think it really makes sense. And then here we do. We have a bit of a larger branch, but for the most part I want them to be smaller. I also want them for the most part to be coming from the top. And we have offshoots from our branches, especially the larger ones. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to start making some more red leaves like that, but we're going to make them larger. We'll start with some of our Cad Red, a little bit of our Naples Yellow, small amount of Mars Black. We want to darken it, but we don't want it to be too dark. And we can do a little test, see how it works against our other reds. I think that's a really nice start, but we could go slightly brighter. And I also have some burnt umber here on my palette for the first time. I'm just going to interject a little bit of that to make it earthy, and I'm going to do something interesting with this mix in that I want different portions of it to be slightly different colors. So we'll have a more red mix, a more pink mix, a more brown mix. We'll also interject some green into part of it. I just want different reds to pull from. And we'll start applying them with our smaller flat-headed brush. Make sure that's nice and damp. Grab one of our new reds, and we can paint on much larger leaves because we are much closer in the foreground. So the closer we get to us, the leaves have an opportunity to become more detailed, just like so. You can see we're going back over the drawing. Again, don't worry. We can always redraw the tree. And it's not tricky. You can always use the traceable up over on Patreon. And if you're unfamiliar with Patreon, up there you can get the traceables, the reference photos. You can get an image of all of the different materials that we use, so you can help with the drawing process, the color matching process. You can print out the reference photos and then paint directly on them to make sure that the colors are correct. You can use the gridded versions of the traceables to make sure that if you're freehand drawing it, it's great, but you can also use tracing paper or a mini projector, something I used to really enjoy doing. Up there you can also get my ebooks, which include Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Teaches you everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first one. There are a bunch of ebooks full of additional traceables as well for the uninspired days. You can also get access to our exclusive Facebook group where the community members share their renditions of these paintings, so you get to see different versions of the lessons, get different inspiration. You can share yours, get feedback. It's a really positive, supportive space. At the higher tiers, you can also get your name in the credits of these videos. So thank you for helping directly support the channel in a big way. On top of that, we also occasionally do art critiques where people send in their artwork and I take a look at it, talk about what's working, what we can bring into future pieces, what we can improve on. And those are fun little bonus videos. We also do polls here and there are a bunch of larger series that we do on 24 by 36 inch canvases. So if you want a much larger piece, we have quite a few of those. They are 10+ hour lessons and they are very thorough. Lots of detail. We get to do more in those than we do here because we have more space. But it's also just a great way of supporting the channel. If you can. If you can't, also no worries. But to everybody up there, big thank you. This channel is predominantly community funded and I'm only able to make lessons like this because of you and your support. So thank you for making this lesson as well as all of the others happen. I know I say it in every video, and I'm sure at some point it gets annoying, but I do think it's important to say thank yous like that, because I love what I do. I love being able to make these videos, and I'm just very thankful that you are essentially providing me the opportunity to do so. There we go. Going over a number of these a couple of times. We're even changing the colors a little bit as we go. Finding I'm wanting to desaturate a lot of them, make them a bit more subtle. So more Naples yellow and titanium white are being added. More so Naples yellow, because I don't want to turn them all into a pink, and the titanium white would do that quite quickly. I think we'll also go with a much more green mix for a little bit. I think that'll be interesting. I just want to make sure that our leaves don't all go in the same direction, so I'll start moving some about in more unique ways. A lot of them push this way for leading line's sake, but we do want some variance. Trying to paint quite a bit of this from a distance, that way, as always, we look at it as a whole and not too detailed. We'll have some leaves down here as well. And once we start adding them to the bottom, this will all start to feel a lot better, because it'll start to feel balanced in a way that it hasn't been. We have quite a few leaves in this space. So yet again, let's try a bit more of a green mix. Still using our red to desaturate it, bring it closer to the other pigments that we are already working with and aware of. I like this a lot. I think this mixed in makes it feel much more natural. These are actual leaves, so we're trying to be intentional with the sharper edges. Need a bit more water on my brush to get it the way I really want it. There we go. This is a big cluster of them. We'll overlap different colors. That's also important. Up until this point, they've all kind of existed within their own spaces, but we do need overlap. Back to reds, yellows, a little bit of Mars black. And we'll also place a couple more towards the top. Going to pick a dominant color, and I think that'll just be orange through here. Then I think we'll go in with something a bit darker. Add a little bit of that darker hue into the oranges, do some blends. Now, stepping back, starting to like it a lot. I think having the reds here, 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 and here really frames the piece nicely. We also have these transitionary pieces, and we also have hints of it throughout, so it's not just the corners. Though, speaking of corners, I think this is a little bit too dense, so I'm going to grab some titanium white, ultramarine blue, hint of our Mars black, remix the bright pigment, or rather brighter pigment that we used in the sky. We'll do a little test on the sky. That's perfect. We got very lucky. And I think I'll re-interject portions of it in between different leaves using a very thick application, not much water on the brush at all, because we are covering a dark area. And this will be significantly easier if we can get good coverage initially. Being very selective. I think I like that. I think I like that a lot. We can always go back and re-add additional foliage, but for now, I think that's great. We're going to, from here, switch to the liner brush, make sure that's nice and damp, and we're going to mix up essentially a brighter variant of all the different pigments that we have in there. So for the reds, we'll actually go with a bit of a pink, still using a hint of our Naples yellow and our Cad yellow. But for the most part, we're rendering a brighter red. We will make it slightly less saturated with a bit of Mars black, but still, brighter is the goal. Then I'm going to go onto the tips of the red leaves that are facing the light. So the left-hand side of them. And on select ones, we'll just throw on this highlight. Sometimes it's just on the corners. We do a little blends back and upwards. But this is going to give the individual leaves dimension and make them stand out to a greater degree. Have a nice little pop to them. Trying to spread this out fairly wide. That way, feels like it really fits within the entirety of the piece. Now we'll mix more of a brighter orange. So Cad yellow, a lot of it. Cad red, titanium white, hint of Mars black still. Take the majority of the pigment off my brush. We don't want to use too much. Now down here, we have a lot of these reds, but that's because we've highlighted them and they're much more noticeable. Now we highlight our oranges and all of a sudden, it's a well-balanced area. Now from there, we do have some branches towards the bottom, and we'll just mix that up with our Cad red, our green, maybe a little bit of burnt umber. You don't need the burnt umber. We didn't use it on this side, and we don't really want to make it not too cohesive, so you don't want to go too heavy into that. But for the most part, we're trying to render a darker hue, earthy, not too saturated. Still using titanium white to desaturate. Maybe a little bit more of that. And I think with the addition of the Mars black, it turned out pretty great. So, clean my brush quite well. We don't want the excess paint making a much larger stroke. We'll grab that. We'll just work our way between leaves. Sometimes going over them, sometimes going behind them. There we are. Just a couple small but powerful applications. Bringing it together. Now, we can use more of that pigment, or at least something very similar, by mixing up an abundance of it. Mars Black, Burnt Umber, Cad Red, or green, into Titanium White and Naples Yellow. And we'll use this, as you can see, for the side of the tree, which is going to cut along the edge right here. We always work on the edges first when we have fresh paint and a damp brush. So it's easier to deliver those sharp lines, but then we can move into the body of the tree. Get a nice application. Probably want to do 2 layers just to make sure it's nice and thick. But this will be a great vignetting piece, and we'll be able to add a lot of detail in the bark. Now we'll create a nice dark texture for our details in there. We're going to go with a darker Mars Black, Cad Red, a little bit of the Burnt Umber. We're going to use less of the Naples Yellow, but we will still use a bit of it. And as you can see, this is quite a bit darker than the pigment that we used for the initial layer. So, we're going to switch on over to a brush you are quite familiar with, that being the fan brush. We are going to go in with it dry so that we get a lot of markings. And vertically, as you can see, I'm just going to tap on all of this texture. We will be layering highlights and details on top of a lot of it, but this will be great for what shows through and creating something that looks quite close to us, right? Because the tree is close, we're going to see a great deal of detail within the bark, and there are also going to be inset areas that are a lot darker that don't get that light. We can create little winding areas, but a lot of the taps and applications are going to be vertical, with even more of them being on the right hand side, and then it opens up more as we get towards the left, just because of how light is going to hit and work around the tree. So less on the left hand side, more taps on the right hand side. Now we'll just head on over to the bottom here. Typically we rotate the brush a lot more than this, but we'll do so on occasion just to get the other side. I'm not going in with real diagonal markings. With the occasional little shift like that, we can double down, we can create little fissured areas, but for the most part, it's pretty similar. Now we're taking another step back and we'll start building more of a highlight for our bark, still starting with the Mars Black and about an equal amount of Burnt Umber. Then we're going to want to brighten it a tad, so we'll go in with our Naples Yellow, which will brighten it but won't really add any saturation, though we do have a nice earthy hue. From there, we are going to add the saturation. We're going to go in with some Cad Red, about double that, in our Cad Yellow. Put both mixtures together. We'll add a little bit of Titanium White to both brighten and desaturate. And I think that's a fantastic pigment to move forward with. From there, we'll switch to our smaller flat-headed brush. Make sure it's nice and damp. And we're going to apply this initially along the edges. And I think, honestly, I have a little bit too much water on my brush. You can see it's very semi-transparent, so I'm going to wipe off the excess there. We're going to go in with pure paint. Much better. Now with this, doing a lot of tap and drags, leaving open areas, and some of them kind of weave in and out of each other. We're going to have less of them as we move towards the back because it's going to get darker. So I move back here as I start to run out of pigment on my brush and it gets significantly more soft. Let's get you a bit closer. Now with this, we need that fresh paint going in on the side. I am leaving little openings, as you can see. And then we'll start to work our way inwards. Lots of taps with slight drag. Sometimes it's just compiled of taps though, like that. And that gives us a nice rugged bark look. Sometimes they can even combine. Now I'm starting to run out of pigment, so I'm applying next to no pressure with my brush, and I'm moving more so towards the right hand side, and you can see that it really, for the most part, dissipates greatly. Grab more pigment. Double down on some pre-existing areas that we like, because every layer we add, we will brighten the pigment and we'll make it more saturated because we're building on top of a brighter base at this point. Trying to make a lot of the tops and the bottoms of my markings nice and sharp. We can start combining some of them as well. Now, I don't want to go too high up on the tree because the higher up we get, the more foliage there is, and that foliage will create shadows on the tree. So we'll do hints of the second, third layer up top, but not as much, and it'll progressively get brighter as we get towards the bottom. I'm also going to switch over to, yet again, my fan brush. Grab some of that pigment, and we'll just tap on some extra texture. I'm going to try to apply this for the most part into areas that already have highlight. That way we're essentially just building on that which we have. We're not creating new complicated areas. It can be a little tricky because we're working with a lot of points, a lot of markings all at once, but it can be a really nice effect. And then as it dissipates, we can move back. Same rule as before. Then back to our palette. A little bit more burnt umber, a little bit more titanium white. Flat-headed brush, not using much water. And we can apply this for the sides and the areas that we really like. Might protrude to a greater degree. Again, I'm not using much water in my mixture. Very intentionally. As we get down towards the bottom, we can also trail off and get a little bit darker again. So the top and the bottom are a bit darker as a whole. It's more so this midsection, which catches the most light, will have the most layers and highlights. Again, we'll still do hints of this up here, but not to the same extent. You can see there are a lot of mini taps. Trying to get individual little corner dabs on there as well, just for little protruding pieces of bark, which don't necessarily connect to a larger area, but will still pop in light regardless. Again, we'll get nice and up close. We'll add in a bit of extra Naples yellow, titanium white, burnt umber. Just continue to brighten that. And remember, every layer will look brighter on the actual canvas. So you don't really need to brighten it a lot because it will happen naturally. I think some added Naples yellow really helps. There we are. It all adds up, right? Now, stepping back, I think that starts to look really, really nice. We do need to add a little bit of foliage on top of our tree so that it doesn't just exist behind it. So I'll go with some red, some Mars black, titanium white, a little bit of burnt umber, maybe a little bit of yellow. But towards the end of these lessons, I typically like to give you a little code word, something you can use in the comments to know that you are part of the, on average, 13% of people who make it to the end of these lessons. So if you are part of that 13%, it's a little, badge of honor. I get to know who makes it to the end. Everybody else who gets to the end gets to see that as well, and it's always fun to see who does so. So today, instead of doing an individual word, I think we're going to go with a phrase or a story. I'd love to know what your favorite part of the fall season is. Something you look forward to every year, whether that be a specific baked good. I currently have pumpkin bread in the oven. Or maybe it's an activity. Maybe you love to go to do apple picking, or maybe it's Halloween. Maybe it's corn mazes. Maybe it's specials on television. Perhaps it's Charlie Brown. Love to know what makes you happy around this time of year. Gets you excited. Just love to see there's positive thoughts and energy in the comments, Now we'll make this a little bit brighter. Not substantially, but enough. We'll add some highlight to those newly applied leaves. Because they are wrapping around the tree, we don't want to add highlight to the ones that are far on the other side, because they aren't really going to receive a lot of light. But there are a couple that will. I think it's important that we get those in there. And also use this opportunity to add some extra highlight to our other ones too. Make it cohesive, right? Splash that color throughout. There we are. We can also make a darker brown. Still using bits of red and green. Switch on over to the liner brush. and paint little branches that can kind of come out of the larger tree. Don't have to. It's not in the reference photo, but I thought it could be a fun idea. Especially if we bring them out. Overlap some foliage. Maybe it gets darker towards the back and we kind of lose where it's coming from. Make the back side of it a bit darker. Grab some of the highlight that we used beforehand. That said, we are coming to the end. And I would like to say a big thank you to all of you for being here. I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for making this lesson and all of the others happen. Remember, up there you can get the traceables, reference photos, bonus lessons, larger lessons, ebooks, access to our exclusive Facebook group, all of that fun stuff. Art critiques. I think I could paint this. I could paint these little pieces forever. Oh, this is so much fun. And again, if you are interested, the brushes are going to be on sale this week, 50% off. There's a link in the description with the code that'll let you save that extra amount. Though again, most importantly, I just love to hear what makes you happy in the autumn season. And I hope your painting goes really well. Hope you found this inspiring and motivating. Hope you have some new ideas and techniques in the back of your head that you're excited to incorporate. And that you just had a nice, relaxed watch with me here today. I love making these, and I love making them with you. So, that, I think, is our lesson. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for just about everything. And I will see you very soon with a brand new painting lesson. We have a bunch of other fall pieces to still release, and I also really want to start doing some seascapes. Again, some beach scenes. I have quite a few in the back of my head, so we'll do that too. See you soon. Thank you for being here. And above all, as always, stay creative.